Yes, we're going to be looking very briefly at bioinformatics, the information of life. And the basic topics for the talk are given on this slide. We're going to talk about the nature of information and data and the differences between them. And there are three types of information that are really significant in bioinformatics type of systems. We'll look at those. Talk a little bit about the role of chance and probability and things like that. And then we'll look at the information processing systems in every cell of the body. An adult human has over 300 trillion cells, and in each cell there are literally thousands of computers built into it. And we'll look at the information processing that goes on with that. We'll look at a little bit at information theory and some of the ramifications that are in information theory, and talk a little bit about information and evolution and what significance there might be there. And then we'll have some time for some unanswered questions. Some of you might be interested in life as a computer. Is it really? Is there computer systems in cells? And we'll look at that today. Some of you may recognize the Charles Babbage's analytical engine. This is actually a model that was built by his son in 1910. Charles Babbage came up with the idea, and he's the father of computers, as you're probably aware, when he designed it, the analytical engine in 1837. But looking at computers as information processing system, Richard Dawkins, for example, says the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal. So there's a lot of similarities there. Carl Sagan has said the information content in a simple cell has been established as around 10 to the 12th bits. Comparable to about 100 million pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So we'll look at different kinds of information. Data may or may not be meaningful, may have meaning or it may not. And binary is the smallest digit that can hold data. And it's rather arbitrary as to what the binary digit represents. But anything that can be represented by a single bit can be stored in a bit. The information is literally attributing form or function to something. And so there are three significant kinds of information when it comes to life. One of them is called functional information, where you have something that's useful, meaningful, purposeful. And the other one is prescriptive. Prescriptive means that there's a recipe, an algorithm that does things in a particular sequence to accomplish some purpose. Computer algorithms, for example, are prescriptive information. The other type of information from information theory is known as Shannon information, and that simply reduces the probability or possibility of something. Shannon information is often referred to as the really significant part of life, but it really isn't. We'll talk about why. But for example, Shannon information, all it does is reduce the probability of something. It is purely probability based. So that, for example, if I tell you I have a pair of dice and I rolled a 2, that gives you a lot of information. You know exactly what I rolled. If I say I rolled a 12, you know exactly what I rolled. If I say I rolled a 7, you have no idea what I rolled because it could have been any one of 6 different possibilities that generate a 7. So the 2 and the 12 contain a lot of information. The 7 contains a relatively small amount of information. The Shannon information entropy is calculated as the bits per symbol that is used times the number of symbols that are used in the message. For example, English text has a Shannon information entropy of anywhere from 0.6 to 1.5 bits per letter, which is a lot less than the 7 or 8 bits per letter that is typically used to store it in a computer. It's also significant that repeating something does not add information. For example, when I have junk, 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 only the first junk contributes to the Shannon information. The rest is just a repeat of that. And when you have something that's predictable, it does not add any information. Okay? The zip program, for example, can reduce the file size by having a different file with the same Shannon information, but in a more concise alphabet, so that you can compress the text files, for example, have a very large compression ratio, whereas if you had a binary file or a random file, that would be the worst, you couldn't compress it at all, because a random file would have no alphabet that would be simpler that you could reduce it to, and therefore you cannot compress it. But basically the zip file has the same Shannon information, but it uses a more concise alphabet to represent it. If we look, for example, at random data versus some planned data, the American Standard Code for Information Interchange, ASCII, has the value that's shown here in those 7 bits to represent the letter capital T. Now, I have, by design, created a string of coins that is the letter ASCII T with a head equal 1, tail equals 0. The top row of coins is simply randomly produced. Now, the probability of getting a match to the bottom pattern by random processes is fairly high. It's 1 in 128, because there are 7 coins. And so by seeing those coins, you could not determine, for example, that that's representing the letter capital T. The only way that it could is if I tell you that that's what it represents. So the idea is when you have functional information, it's important that both the sender and the receiver understand the rules for that. For example, if you send this bit pattern to a printer, what would get printed? Well, if there was no such thing as ASCII to define the American Standard Code for Information Interchange, you wouldn't have any idea what's going to be displayed on the screen or printed on the printer or whatever. But those rules say those characters are represented by coded information that is very specific. And if everybody follows those rules, you can communicate. Can you ever detect information without knowing what the protocol rules are? For example, I pointed out before, if you just had the 7 bits of information, there's no way to determine a priori that that means anything. But if you have information that is very complex and it matches a pattern that you know, then you can say, oh, that's information. So that, for example, if you had that pattern that's shown there, that could be counting in binary up to 7. Could be. But if you had that pattern, you wouldn't know that for sure, because it might have just by chance matched the counting to 7. If you continued on and had a few thousand bits of information and it continued the same pattern, then you could say, there's some information here because I can detect something of very high complexity that matches a pattern that I know about, and therefore it must be information. If, for example, you took a die and rolled it 100 times, you would get a very complex pattern, but that pattern would contain 0 information because there would be no usefulness to it. The probability of having an acceptable pattern, if you were willing to accept any roll, would be 1 to the 100th power, which is 1. So it's a certainty, and certainties contain no information. A repeat of that pattern, however, would take 10 to the 70th centuries to, by random processes, repeat that pattern. That's when it would be expected to happen. In the movie and the book Contact, for example, in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, they detected a sequence of the first 25 prime numbers. And since that is extremely unlikely to happen by chance, they said, there must be extraterrestrial intelligence because I detected a complex pattern that's specified in the sequence. Therefore, I can say that must be information. So information is important for detection. You need to have it both complex and specify something that I know about in order to determine that it is.